Although, I gotta say, I'm very challenged by the authenticity game and the justification game. Because what is an apologetic and why apologize? More, I want to say, viscerally resonant fundamentalism doesn't need so much theology to justify it, or maybe to reconcile some kind of distances. But let's say this is part 2 of 3 in the series, just doing one thing, comparing and contrasting what I think are the two most important Jewish books of the last year. In anticipation of Passover, I'd say the two most informative and liberating pieces of new Jewish constructive literature. Today we're looking at Kosher Astrology by the Rebbe Yitzchok Pinkesz. I want to confess my alienation from the vibe of this book from the beginning. The audience is deeply, I would say, Lakewood Yeshivish, by which I mean English speaking, English first language, but as conservative, an ultra orthodoxy as exists with English literacy. Because there's the ones that don't have English literacy because they're traditional, And then there's the ones that do and did, and this is really what happened in Jersey. This is really the entire Yeshivish pivot and many other modern Orthodox communities, most of which I'd say really happened before the war. And the big schism is between before the war and after the war, because the yeshivas got here a little bit before the war. And then they got bigger, they brought people and they managed people and they saved as many people as they could save in their way. But their mechanisms for constructing community famously have a lot to do with just, being part of a thing altogether. And the specific nature of that conservatism is informed by its own range of deeply accepted modernisms. And let's say the English language and modern orthodoxy itself really are one of those. And so one of the funny challenges are, let's say, with something that was rather gauche and frowned upon popularly, although I tell a lie, astrology is huge. I remember as a kid, why is it in the newspapers? It was such a basic and fundamentally informative thing the whole time. I think because of the range of, Catholic influences in the development of newspapers and distribution of newspapers. But it's really associated, let's say, there with, not Jewish. And of course, anyone who's done any sort of deep dive into the Torah knows astrology comes up a lot, especially in the early Midrashim, where the theology of astrology presumes absolute accuracy and competence, except to the degree that people can't really interpret signs so well. Like an oracle, right? An oracle says a great nation will fall, doesn't necessarily say which one. And astrology says particular kinds of change, but doesn't really necessarily always necessarily give you quite specific, tremendous detail, because it's not what it's designed for. So what is it designed for? And herein lies the challenge, I think, of the concept of a kosher astrology being meaningful. Because initially, as an apologetic argument for the thing that's fine and why it's fine, I have to confess, I did kind of write a book like that about weed one time, a long time ago. But I think I emphasized early on that kosher is a little meaningless once it's clear that something's good, right? And herein lies a lot of my instinctive frustration with this book, which is, as someone who really has spent some time thinking and learning about the range of meanings and associations of astrological symbols in the Torah over different generations, I do want to say mostly conflicting, and by mostly conflicting, I mean like there's not really a universal consensus about which of the 7 planets is which sephira, or even which forefather, because it depends on different schematas. And that is one of the cool things about the Talmud, the range of ways a fundamental principle like 7 is applied to mean a lot of different things, including the sun, including the moon, including Saturn, who's not the number 7, and there's always a reason why everyone graduates and everyone passes through certain gates and certain kind of forms. I'll tell you what I really dug about this book, though, because there is a real insight in it, which is the thing I really wanted from astrology in the first place. Because a lot of how I first got into, let's say, B'nai Yissaschar and the Sefer Yetzirah and the fundamental texts of the Kabbalah that are so informed by the same 3, 7, and 12 that are the shape of the neoclassical sort of heavens and spheres. 3's polarities, and then a sort of 7-based polarity, and then a sort of 12-based sort of, angularity. And great, that's basic science. That's Babylon, Egypt, and Rome. Oh man, it's archaic. It's archaic wisdom and well calculated, and certainly rooted in its own alchemical construction breakdown, narrative and tradition. And that's great, and that's nifty. And he doesn't deal with that. This book is not so much about that. And this breaks my heart, because let's say the theology of what is Judah, what is Yosef and Ephraim and Menashe, the entire theology of who are the tribes of Israel and what do they mean, and what is what should we learn from the story or be sensitive to it in the application of its fundamental clarities in our lives socially. What do we learn about how to be from these things? And there's so much Torah about that. The Sefer Yetzirah is literally about that. The B'nai Yissaschar really does spend a lot of time, and they all come up. They're all mentioned. This is a great compilation of just a big list of just the Jewish astrological sources. And it's functioning more as a proof text. Now, blessedly, Yitzchok Pinkesz put his astrology up on his website, which is, going to be there in the links in the comments or in the edited, in the, section description. Gemini Sun sort of explains why it has to be said. Cancer Moon explains why there's so much care about trying to have a deep thing in it. Because I'll tell you, he does sneak in the most wonderful deep insight that offers to help us understand the Torah in the context of modernity and modernity in the context of Torah. And it's like this. I'm just going to describe, table of contents. Part 1, astrology is kosher, astrology in Judaism, astrology and astronomy, deeper meaning, Rosh Chodesh, natural alignment, fundamental sources. Section B, I'm skipping, that's chapter 3. Section B, different types of techniques and practices, definitions, magic, mancy, kosher. Section 3, prohibition, proofs, arguments over the years. Oh, everyone loves those. Just technical arguments over the years by different sources about, when. No, it's great. Chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, just a lot of just arguments about it. Section D, just the big medieval guys, Rambam's rationalism, which includes neoclassicism, which includes, the zodiac, and Ramban's full-on mythic magic wonderland of language that creates and symbolism that describes, but that's not what his sections are called. His sections are just really more listing. Bless the hearts of, I associate it with the Beis Yosef, this kind of systematic thinking in relationship to what I experience as something like an autism, systems and the Inyan of giving something over improving it. This is the Rambam's accomplishment and sort of binding weight in the foundation of Orthodox Judaism, right? The Rambam sets a thing, it doesn't matter why, and it does matter why, and that's why the Rambam's saying it, but it liberates through the detail from the story, chas v'shalom. Here's where it gets interesting. In part 2, chapter 17, before describing a sort of therapeutic modality that I suspect classes are being given around, interpersonal sort of therapy sort of sessions are being given around, in between or right before a lot of that, just a description, basically how to make your own charts and things. This is what I'm amazed by. Just the mention of the new planets. And then at the end of which, in section C, the zeitgeist of the newly discovered planets. And this made the whole book worthwhile. Chapter 26 and chapter 27 describe why history moved the way she do and why collective morality and collective priority become what she become because and with the revelation of heretofore unrevealed planets that were surely always there, much like forms of capitalism existed before the official, development of international capital. There's always sort of mercantile forms, right? Or just about doing the thing you want and just selling it, stealing the sacred apples, getting them on the market. Can't say you can't. Starting a new life over there, whatever. Right, the mercurial has been very revealed, but something more sublime, let's say Uranus, was only discovered in the year 1781. And these are the 4 sections in chapter 26, Uranus 1781. I read it, it's amazing. Yitzchok makes the argument that liberalism, democracy, but really liberalism, the fundamental spirit of it, emerges with Uranus, who functions as an avatar for the whole thing. It is the ruling underlying fundamental orthodoxy, the entire sky, right? Kalis, that symbolizes and expresses self-expression, and just like a form of oblivious self-actualization, so identifiable with just, the framing of the whole revolution as if it was about like independence and like freedom and liberation, really kind of in there about that, in the self-driven kind of way, pioneering like, because there's the colonial things that happen in the 1490s, let's say, but then there's the one that happened after the wars are kind of already fought, right? After the wars are basically finished, let's say the 1750s, 1760s, basically when they start to make a new charter around honest acknowledgement of the terms, liberalism, from the self. Yeah. But then Neptune, 1846. Now, a few chapters later, he even goes as far as say that Neptune is communism. Neptune is socialism, 1846, and everything around it is also the emergence, the beginnings of the worker struggle, and the resensitivity of humans to something less personally driven, but more sort of like collectively water driven. And that's what they're associating with Neptune. And that is the consensus. And here, in a perfect Hegelian way, right? Thesis, antithesis, right? Positive and negative manifestation of Uranus and Neptune, the ways they totally, can go either way. Goes as far as to say that Ayn Rand is a great avatar of Uranus, totally self-driven in a romantical kind of way. God have mercy on us all. And Bernie Sanders, bless his heart, Yechi Adonenu, like with Neptune, not me, us, not me, us, a collective oceanic experience, which is socialism. And in my previous cosmologies, I've associated these with the bull and the lion in the chariot, of Isaiah, and thus also Taurus as nationalism and Leo as socialism, the friendly lion sort of bringing in and depends on relationship to the other while still wanting to be expressed. This is so fascinatingly nuanced as a different model and expression. And then Pluto and Chiron. Now, he does a cool thing where he tries to bind each of these personages to characters in the Bible, problematic or good. The one he does for Pluto is actually the entire story of Jacob's confrontation with Esau, and even brings up a wonderful gematria from Rav Simcha Bunomschitz, one of the best Hasidic rabbis and pharmacologists, who points out Israel is gematria Seir plus Yaakov. Seir, is a vigorous he-goat, kind of a satanic figure associated with Esau. And everyone knows Jacob. Jacob becomes Israel when he integrates Seir, the evil goat nature, which I've long read as a Mercury aspect changing into a Mars aspect, is Yaakov into Israel. And the instability of it, even with the promise being, they won't call you Yaakov anymore, they'll call you Israel. But Israel is a much more challenged and controversial name and title. I think it has been for a long time. I think it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle with that title for a long time because of the martial sense of self-righteousness that is the difference between Israel and Yaakov traditionally, being willing to engage Esav, and not from righteousness or self-righteousness, but from righteousness or self-righteousness. Happy to confront his brother with how sorry he is, The integration of the sort of Mercury fear thing with a sort of unfear of the other. And I want to say a lot of the unfear that Jacob has for Esau, I think he's scared he'll hurt Esau more than he's scared of being killed. I think he's scared that any of them can get killed because he loves his brother. And Chiron, the wounded healer. Pluto in 1930 and Chiron in 1977 goes as far as try to argue that 1977 is when PTSD was first discovered and when alternative therapies first started to cross over, which is at least formally, at least as a formal federal body, which are interesting markers and ways of marking social shift and movement. And it is nice of him to try to launder these into the good orthodoxy so that the Litvish replication and reproduction machine can and will include some of these values, which I think was one of the great hopes of some of the more ethically innovative Rabbanim, like Rav Shneur Zalman Auerbach, or even Avigdor Miller, each on their level, who bring in a form of chesed that really a rich community would have found a way to avoid successfully if someone early on hadn't just thrown it in, and now they are stuck with that story for as long as anybody tells it to them on any of their occasions. But then the book continued to break my heart because it doesn't seem to understand or want to understand or think about the meaning in the astrology of the Torah, which is one of the major messages of the Zohar, and I'd say the entire esoteric tradition. On one foot, there's a really easy one that you can always bring up that's super elemental, because you don't have to talk about 12 when you talk about astrology. You can just talk about the light that goes and the light that comes back. You can just acknowledge what any of the theologies, and they're listed, are saying, but he's not trying to do that as much as just say, hey, good news. There are theologies, and say it. But Rav Yid, why not just say the theology and the thing with it, which is, I'd argue, such a big perush on the Torah, right? Because there's an ongoing conflict in the whole written Torah between Joseph and Judah. And it's not a hate conflict. It's an overlap conflict between whatever Joseph symbolizes and whatever Judah symbolizes, paralleling Esau and Yaakov famously. And there is a fascinating and contemplatable theology here that's accessible, that's simple and straightforward. It's elemental, right? Because you can, and they have really done a lot of great work, all those old esotericists, defining Yosef as the structure thing, the golden calf and the nationalism, that is the structural thing, that is love for the structural thing. And again, something like an autism, but embedded, just a faith in a system that creates the bureaucratic heart that loves rules because rules really will solve the problem. And then there's the Davidic Judah thing at the other end of the polarity. And again, very much associatable with Taurus relative to Leo, although that's only kind of half a polarity. That doesn't explain the distance from Scorpio to Aquarius, or the 7th month holiday, which is also winds up associated with Joseph, or at least Ephraim. All of this could have come up in this book with a very brief sort of sentences. Instead, there's a lot of charts just about dates, which is fascinating and bold, and some amazing deep Torahs sort of in between as like footnotes. And I love that model. I don't mind the things I didn't like about it because they're not for me. They're for getting people who have to be proven things to understand things, I guess. But while you're there, why not also throw in the rest of the things, my friends? At least I feel like the Yosef Yehuda thing resolves and helps explain so many of the midrashic conflict concepts, let's say between the Leviathan and the Shor Bor and so on. But I guess everyone's got to start somewhere. My concern is just when a great work is done, people often don't look for the rest of the surrounding context. And isn't that just the problem with the Rambam and the Rambamists? Starry night feels so right. Starry night, I going out today. Ay, ay. Starry night, evening flight. I've gotta make it home to my baby. Happy Passover, folks. This is part 2 of 3. I'm going to finish contrasting this book to a much more controversial one. Anti-Zionist Siddur coming up. Good job, Yitzchok Pinkesz.